Okay, thank you for coming, for being here. We are at the fourth panel of the academic conference. It's called Digital Harassment Against Women Journalists. And we will start by the first presentation that is called Mapping Digital Violence Against Women Journalists in Indonesia in 2021. The author is Mas Duki. He is an associated professor of the Department of Communications of Universitas Islam Indonesia. And please, Dr. Mastuki, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, Uruguay time. Just to make me sure, do you hear my voice?
We can hear you, yes, perfectly.
Okay, good. So in Indonesia now it's a late night, very late night, or perhaps early morning, 4th May 2022. So let me directly share my PowerPoint. And first of all, I would like to thanks for the organizer who organizing this very challenging conference. And I'm so honored to be here to present my insights, my findings regarding the topic mentioned by the moderator recently. So this is my PowerPoints entitled Mapping Digital Violence Against Women Journalists in Indonesia. And as I mentioned by the moderator, I'm a lecturer, associate professor from Department of Communications, Universitas Islam Indonesia, Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So for the introductions, you can see here that during the last 2 years, violence against women journalists in Southeast Asia, mainly Indonesia, I guess, received global attention when Maria Ressa, a female journalist from the Philippines, experienced extensive digital violence in her country. And last year, she received the Nobel Prize with Russian journalist Muratov. I guess they are represent the critical journalists who are facing threat in the developing countries or in developing democracy, including Indonesia. So my paper will examine a national survey entitled Mapping the Digital Violence Experienced by Indonesian Female Journalists throughout 2021, who were collected on August and September 2021 from about more than 1,000 women journalists across Indonesian cities. And also, I, with my researcher teams, complemented the survey by in-depth interview with about 6 women journalists working for several types of media in Indonesia. So to make you a bit background more on Indonesia, why Indonesia? Yeah, so mainly because following the end of authoritarian period in 1998, the Indonesian political authorities guarantee formally Indonesian journalists with freedom of publications coming from the law number 40, 1999. And this law provides journalists for a relatively freedom of journalistic practices. Also, if we go into the some international press freedom ranking, for instance, from Freedom House or Reporters Sans Frontiers, Indonesia mark its a bit higher position in the press freedom ranking. As you can see here, the country was in 57 in 2002. However, it goes down into 110 in 2003 up to the current times. Indonesia at least provide journalists, including women journalists, a limited freedom to provide information for their journalistic professions. However, following the invasion of digital media environment, some tendencies of digital harassment in their newsroom and in the reporting field might again those ideal situation as I mentioned in this slide. So in the coming slide, I will show you some critical situation regarding women journalists in Indonesia. So according to the survey, overall, at least there are 10 types of violence experiencing by women journalists from both physical and digital violence. For instance, sexual natures, insult related to religion, ethnicity, and race, victim of the spreading disinformation or misinformation, gender discrimination in the workplace, sexual harassing comments, non-sexual, verbal trait of sexual nature, body shaming, and non-sexual traits. So you can see here a various type of trait experiencing by women journalists both in their office and in the field when they are reporting case or when they are conducting investigative journalism. So this study, this survey emphasized that the digital violence, as at least that taught by about 1,000, more than 1,000 female journalists in Indonesia, experience related to the two identities of them. The first one, their status as a professional journalist, mainly as an investigative journalist, and more importantly, their status as a woman itself. So there is a gender issues here. Well, the next slides inform you about how women journalists in Indonesia respond to violence. At least I can say to you today 5 types of the response. The first one, they prefer to report the threat experience to their top leaders in the newsroom or their colleges, alongside to report to the relevant journalist association. For your information, in Indonesia, we have at least 5 different journalist associations, from the specific newspaper association to the cyber media journalist association. Some other women journalists also file a lawsuit to the court, and others try to advocate their problem from individual approach, such as they to deal with them alone, having discussion, dialogue with perpetrators of violence, etc. And lastly, several victims eager to take an open for public methods, launching counterattacks, speak up their stories to relatives, and put article as a form of public defense. If you see here, there are a very complex style of how women journalists expose their case from a very individual approach into the what I call public engagement approach, which might come from their ability itself to save themselves. So to summarize, so far, of course, I'm happy to get response question, clarification from you all following the end of my presentation. According to my research to the survey I delivered today to you, that women journalists in Indonesia are experiencing threat following the rapid digital media environments because of their two social identities. The first one, because they are a journalist carrying a social facts, public interest issues that is not conducive for quality of journalism. The second, because of their position as a woman in what I call discriminatory socio-economic and political space in Indonesia. My paper today, my presentation today also show that this is my organization, PR2 Media in English, mean the regulation and regulatory watch institution for Indonesian media identify so many types of violence against women journalists. Violence occur both in the physical and digital form, either in their workplace, also in their reporting fields. So this paper invite us to get more attention, either as a woman journalist itself, as a media advocate and media regulator, how to solve this problem together. So this is the last slides. In my view, mitigation is needed. So mitigation of violence must be on our agenda, both from local particular nation and from international communities. In my view, female journalists as experienced in Indonesia could be as survivors, play also a role as an activist to their willingness to tell the stories and having collaboration to overcome the violence they experience. However, more importantly, press companies, journalist associations, civil societies in Indonesia and international level should carry out campaign as well as legal advocacy in addition to build a conducive work for women journalists. In Indonesia, now we have press council, of course, as I'm sure in other democratic countries, should produce what I call the protocol, the policy, encourage the structural problem within the growing threat to Indonesian women journalists. That's what I can say to you so far, and thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to hear if any question, clarification later on. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mastuki. Now we are going to listen to Bruno Futtuoso Costa, who is a researcher from the University of Coimbra, and he's going to talk about women journalists in the pandemics of digital hate, a time where less is more. So Bruno, if you are there, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to present this study named Women Journalists in the Pandemics of Digital Hate, a time where less is more. Since 2015, the safety of women journalists has assumed itself as a research object, attracting more and more interest from researchers to identify, explore, and analyze the nature, prevalence, means of support, and personal, journalistic, and democratic impacts, crossing online and offline context of the new specific aggressions of the digital environment, mostly on the Eastern context, namely in the United States, United Kingdom, and the European countries. The categorization of digital violence against women journalists has gone through a wide range of terms, concepts, and derivations, making it difficult to establish a common conceptualization and performance framework within academia, which consequently rise a whole set of complexities to ensure the protection of journalists. Based on two scientific studies that conducted a systematic review of terms and concepts used in academia research to characterize digital violence against women journalists, the aim of this study was to identify the appropriate way to conceptually characterize the phenomenon and also the elements that need to be considered for future legislation. These studies were coded and interpreted with a proposed full set of variables focusing on terminological and conceptual approach by combining meta-analysis with content analysis. During the studies on digital violence against women journalists, it's identified that several and different references have been used. As shown in Table 1, 25 concepts of violence were introduced for 13 studies. This corresponds to an average use of 2 concepts per study. Also, there is a greater acceptance regarding online harassment and online abuse and their terminological derivations, which reveals a great diversity of terms and concepts. However, the community does not share a common terminological framework to define violence practice, having difficulties to locate the literature in databases, to establish comparative studies between countries, and to state legislate and develop public policies that recognize and solve the phenomenon. Also, the published studies expose how violence against women journalists is strongly rooted not only in countries known to be hostile toward journalists. The worldwide phenomenon is analyzed and disseminated from various methodological angles of approach, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed, with victims repeatedly experiencing daily, weekly, and monthly a wide range of violent practice over the course of their entire working lives. While the impacts of digital violence are well supported empirically, the same is lacking for the emotional labor that women journalists have to perform. This means that the phenomenon will always need to be examined at the micro forms of violence and macro forces, social dynamics, and systems of oppression, levels of intersectional identities, as contextually situated individual experiences, since they contribute to the formation of journalists' autonomy and security and are associated with the quality of their role in democracy. In this framework, it's worth noting that there is a clear difference between defining and describing the phenomenon. We propose that digital violence against women we propose that digital violence against journalists be conceptually defined as the individual, collective, and or organized act of moral, sexual, political, and economic harassment, which may be associated with gender, offense, and incitement to hatred of others, capable of deliberately harming their fundamental rights, as well as surveilling, disciplining, and silencing the freedom of the press by undermining the sense of physical safety and psychological well-being in the personal and private spheres of the victims. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bruno. Now we are going to listen to Samiska Koirala talking about digital harassment and South Asian women journalists, challenges and strategies. Please, Samiska, we are hearing you now.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's past midnight here in Kathmandu, Nepal, yet I hope I look all energized. The main reason I have focused on South Asian experience in my work is because of three different reasons. First, South Asian region is very much under researched when it comes to the issue of digital harassment, and more so in the case of academic research. And the next one is South Asia faces one of the largest gender gaps online globally, and online safety is one of the barriers to gender equitable internet access, according to various studies. And I have focused on the personal experiences because I believe that it sort of opens a deeper insight to the problem, and bringing on these experiences might be very helpful to come up with some effective strategies when it comes to ensuring digital safety to women journalists. Well, while women journalists in South Asia have been more visible in the last decade, a number of women journalists are on rise. Women are also taking up senior positions, but there are many problems that are very much there, and it mainly falls on the area of safety and security. Safety concerns of women journalists is definitely a global issue, but safety concerns are exacerbated in patriarchal societies where the social and cultural misconceptions of women interplay with criticisms against women journalists. While talking about the digital harassment, I think we can't ignore the fact that internet has actually also provided opportunities to women journalists of this reason, as it is helping to break up this gender gap in the profession. But like I stated before, it has also added to the new challenges that needs to be addressed. So mainly the coming to the objective of my study, it is to understand gendered risks in the digital space, more than the online harassment aspect. I am focusing on the coping mechanism. How are they trying to address it from the individual level? What is being done? So that is a more focus of my study. So I have used a post-colonial feminism and intersectional feminism, and I try to look into some of the unique strategies that have actually worked, and that might actually work in other countries with a similar socio-cultural similarities. Methodologically, I have a very small sample, since it's a qualitative study. I have my findings mainly rely on in-depth interviews from 15 women journalists from India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. The study focuses on how has online abuse affected them in a personal and professional level, and more on how they fought back or what were their coping mechanism. Although the number are small, I think it's very much representative, and I have also used a number of references of various policies, different kind of social media posts. I have also analyzed code of conducts and also some news stories on this regard. My work is still very much in progress, but quickly going to the preliminary findings, it shows that in all the countries that I have studied, there's a lack of support from the government agencies. That was very much prominent. And I'm sure you know about Rana Ayub's case, and that incident alone speaks a volume about what actually the state is doing in order to address the issue of digital harassment. And the other fact that I discovered was the women journalists, especially those who are from marginal community, be it from religious minorities or from those who identify themselves from LGBTQI community, they felt, although very few in number, of course, they feel more vulnerable. And the experiences, no matter South Asia as a region looks like it has a very much similar socio-cultural context, but the experiences was very much varied, not against countries, but even in a country where I interviewed like 3 different women journalists, and the news organization they were associated had so much to do with their experience. And the other thing I noticed in this region was that there are a number of policies and advocacies also ongoing, but it's very much fragmented, and the programs are also very much fragmented, and they are not making that much of impact. And the other challenge in my findings was hindrances in reporting mechanism, and that I think even my friend who was presenting in previous panel from Uganda, she also reported that, and I would like to say that we have a very much similar experiences in this region too. And the other one was lack of proper training, although most of them said that they had some sort of safety related training, they didn't find it very useful. And I really need to quote that one of the participants shared that one of the techniques she learned during the training was the trainer asked her to tolerate the abuse, because if you just ignore the abuse, if you tolerate, the abuser will go away. That was what she was taught, and which I personally find very disturbing. And that too, if that is happening in a training session, so I really don't know where are we heading towards. And focusing now, coming towards the end, on the strategies and their coping mechanism. The first thing the journalists, especially from Sri Lanka and India, were found doing was they were seeking support from journalist unions and their news organizations. And some of them said that it was satisfactory. They were getting the support they needed. And the other interesting or unique strategy that I found while interviewing journalists from Nepal and Pakistan was they have actually formed this informal peer support group, which is even in the form of WhatsApp group or a messenger group, where there are a bunch of women journalists from certain province or working in a certain organization, and where they talk to each other in case there's some abuse, or if they can support each other in a psycho-social level. And the trend of fighting back on online platform was seen in India, in Bangladesh. And the other coping mechanism that more or less all the participants said that they somehow believe that, that tolerating part that I talked about before, you need to develop that thick skin. If you are in journalism, you have to be very strong. You have to be very masculine. So most of them during the conversation shared those kind of experiences, so they come from that schooling. And the other mechanism that I think even my colleagues from other countries also have indicated that finding that they're opting out from the social media, that they're choosing to staying offline and self-censoring their social media posts and news contents with the fear of attack. Even in the case they haven't experienced severe harassment, they told that they have actually seen their friend being harassed for political news stories on gender, or even in a personal level sometime. So although this is a work in progress, some of my final thought towards the end is I strongly felt during the process of the analysis that we actually need a cultural or let's say regional specific focus on the formulation of policies and strategies, because the problem is similar, but the nature of harassment is different, and the coping mechanism is different, and how the news organizations are responding is different. So I think it has to be a region or culture specific. And intersectional feminist approach was largely missing, be it in policies, be it in training. So in countries from South Asia, where it's very much rich in cultural diversity, I think we really need that one. And the strong advocacy against victim blaming culture is needed. Of course, it is not limited within the victim blaming culture, is not limited within journalism. It is all over the society. But I think if we could develop or we could advocate on this area, at least the women journalists who are facing abuse would be able to expose or would be able to report that. But it seems like it's not much happening. And this peer support group I was talking about, it is working up to some extent, but they don't have any funding, or they even don't have enough training to be able to help each other in a proper way. So maybe the focus should be there as well. And some of the experiences from, or some of the efforts from news organization was praiseworthy. So So maybe our focus should be more on news media organizations should be made more accountable, and some of the internal policies they have worked so well means maybe those policies can be replicated in other news organizations as well. And these practices, it needs to be uplifted, especially in countries like ours where political instability is there and government is not showing that much of a commitment. So I think the first place to start with would be collaborating with news media organizations and making them more accountable. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Samiska. Now we have the last author in person, who is Sisanda Koala. He's a final year PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, Center of Rhetoric Studies. Sorry. And the article, the presentation is called Language as Symbolic Action in Digital Mob Censorship, a Burkean analysis of tweets directed at South African female journalists reporting on high-profile cases. Please, Sisanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I must just correct that I have actually graduated now. So I'm doctor. I think the bio was old.
Outdated.
Yeah, thank you so much. Could you please bring up my presentation? Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening to those watching online, wherever you may be. I am the last person speaking on this academic conference, so I hope I end off with a bang. As the moderator said, my topic is on language as symbolic action in relation to online violence against journalists in the South African context. And as we've heard throughout this conference, online violence against journalists is a global phenomenon, and the studies that have been outlined have documented patterns suggesting that specific groups of journalists, particularly defined by gender, are likely targets of online harassment, which is intended to make women journalists in particular self-censor. So my study focuses on the use of language as symbolic action for mob censorship in digital spaces against female South African journalists. And the contribution to the broader discussion on online violence against women journalists that the study endeavors to make is really twofold. Firstly, it's one of the few studies, according to my surveying of the research landscape, that really gives an in-depth discussion on the issue from a South African perspective. As has been argued by the literature highlighted throughout the day, most of the current research really focuses on Western contexts. And there's minimal understanding on how the social dynamics in countries like South Africa, which firstly have a history of racial segregation and currently have a reality characterized by extremely high levels of violence against women, shape the online discourses used against women journalists whose profession really is about challenging the entrenched systems of power. And then secondly, the study aims to build on the prevailing approaches methodologically in terms of looking not at the self-reporting of women journalists on their experiences, but rather by undertaking an interpretive analysis of the content, in this case the tweets, that are directed at the journalists to really tease out the nuanced ways linguistic elements are used to mete out violence against them. So through the use of this notion of language as symbolic action, the study hopes to show that even when there isn't overt expressions of violence against women journalists, the use of devices, rhetorical devices like name-calling and chastisement is intended to perform the actions of belittling and admonishing these women journalists into silence. So just to give a bit of context, people who use Twitter will know that, you know, if you use direct hate on Twitter, you can be reported and that will result in your account being blocked. And also in South Africa, we've got a civil society-led initiative called the Real 411, where people who post violence or misinformation get reported by the public to this platform, and then the public, the platform then sort of regulates that. So when I explain the methodology, when I looked at the tweets, you won't see overt threats I'm going to kill you, I'm going to rape you, that kind of content. It is more subtle. And I think the argument at the heart of my paper is that even these online, these subtle approaches such as belittling and chastisement need to be viewed as violence because they have that effect of keeping women journalists off the platform, or if they are on the platform, steering them into certain kinds of discourses. So my key ideas are mob censorship, and we had the previous presenter really elaborate on this idea of mob violence and how it feeds into mob censorship. But in a nutshell, how I've defined, or how it's defined in my study, is violence exercised by ordinary citizens against journalists with the intention to intimidate and silence the press. And the key here is that it's ordinary citizens. It's not from political actors, whether in government or influential in society. It's normal people who are maybe doing it because they support a particular societal leader. So that is the one aspect. And then the notion of language as symbolic action, it was coined by the rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke, who says that the view of language is as a species of action, symbolic action, and its nature is such that it can be used as a tool. So the language used in violent social media posts against women journalists, in terms of how I'm arguing in my paper, is not just to communicate about violence, but it is actually an act of meting out violence in and of itself. So with my study, it is a qualitative content analysis that employed rhetorical and thematic analysis to consider the tweets. I looked at 6 South African journalists' Twitter feeds, and I considered both what they tweeted as well as the replies or people who tweeted them. These journalists that I considered are really some of our top female journalists, ranging from political reporters, legal reporters, famed news anchors, and they were selected purposively because of the place they play in our in our media landscape. And the key question I sought to explore is what symbolic action is performed in the way language is used in violent tweets directed at selected South African women journalists. And I looked at a really mundane period. So not really, there wasn't any political activity, there wasn't anything really major. January, people are coming back from work. So it was to see on an ordinary month period, what kind of language is used when directing or speaking to these journalists, to get a sense, because obviously when there is a political issue, the discourse can be heightened because of that. But my interest is in the everyday conversations that are directed at women journalists, what kind of language is used. So there were 2 main approaches or linguistic devices that I found. The first was the use of the rhetorical device of belittling. And this approach was to belittle these women into silence through name calling. So most of the tweets that were coded as exhibiting violent language against women journalists employed name calling as a communicative strategy. And I forgot to mention in my analysis, I used Cresswell and Poth's approach to coding. So I started off looking generally at the feeds, and then I did just a first glance as to which tweets might seem to be violent, and then I did a more in-depth and iteratively, and I arrived at these particular communicative strategies. So in their book on propaganda, Alfred and Elizabeth Lee posit that as a rhetorical device, name calling is giving an idea a bad label to make us reject and condemn the idea without examining the evidence. So in this regard, there were 2 main ways in which name calling was used against these journalists. Firstly, these journalists were called names on the basis of their race, and secondly, it was also on the basis of their gender. And I think this is one of the reasons contexts like South Africa need to be studied in greater depth, because while in global contexts, we definitely see gender issues coming through in how journalists are harassed. In contexts like South Africa, where race really plays a role, it is a specific area that journalists are targeted. And not surprisingly, but it might be surprising to people who aren't from the country, but it's both black and white journalists. So it's not, specifically targeting a particular racial category, but race is employed irrespective. So the one, and apologies for the poor qualities in the picture. So in the first tweet, which is on the left, it says of the journalist, "You drew fake graphs and got an award, Moloi wa Lekhoa," which this journalist basically did a story where she used graphics, and the person saying that she drew fake graphs, but then the word or the phrase that they use is basically translated into "you witch who is white," and that kind of language of and I go into it in the paper, I just have not really gone in depth in this presentation, of describing women as witches and clamoring on the fact that this person is a white witch really evokes certain emotive responses in our context. And then on the right side, there is a tweet directed at a black journalist, and that one reads, let me just scroll to it. That one is about the woman being a house Negro, which basically describes black people who are said to assimilate or try and aspire to whiteness. So we see that race is really used against women journalists, whether they are black or white, using particular insults and belittling terms that have certain connotations in our context. And then the second linguistic device was trying to admonish these women into silence through chastising them. And here there were two main ways. It was through sexual innuendo and through mentalism. And I know other speakers have spoken around the sexual innuendo aspect, so I won't go into detail in that, but it in our context, which is already really one of the most violent countries against women, the use of these of sexual innuendos has just even greater meaning than in context where if you threaten a woman sexually, it is just a threat. In our context, it could actually have implications. And then, so in these two examples, through sexual innuendo, there's a tweet that says to the journalist, she needs to get laid to deal with her horny brain, which really aligns with a misogynistic view that wild women need to be tamed through sex, and that women who do not conform to the prevailing perspectives on femininity by challenging power, because she is a legal journalist, are deviant, she's a political journalist, are deviant and should be brought back in line by getting them a man. Then on the other hand, there's this approach where journalists, particularly female journalists, are called crazy, or their mental health challenges are made fun of in order to try and silence them. And the gendered nature of mental health is really documented as far back as the second millennium in BC, where women were prone to be diagnosed with hysteria, that it was really viewed to be their natural state. So in the same way as with the sexually depraved women, when a woman is described as crazy or having mental illness, such descriptions really are admonishments that are meant to silence her into obedience based on what is a patriarchal view of what is a good and noble woman, namely one who does not challenge power. So this woman, journalist, is someone who has shared publicly about mental health issues, trying to advocate for awareness. And in tweets like this, where they say, this one is skipping her brain medication and taking it for granted, basically the tweeter is using that against her to try and silence her. So in conclusion, when language is viewed as symbolic action as opposed to merely a communicative strategy or device, strategies such as belittling and chastisement are viewed as acts meant to perform certain functions. In the case of a public-facing platform like Twitter, these acts aren't just solely aimed at the journalist. They serve as a public performance of shaming and admonishment that undermines the women as people and professionals, particularly when the women are engaged in the journalistic tasks of holding powerful social actors to account. The people who are doing this aren't only discrediting these women primarily for who they are, but they then fuel hate towards them based on race and gender and discredit them by playing into well-entrenched stereotypes of sexually depraved and crazy women, people who should not be taken seriously. The power of the communicative strategies and linguistic devices described in the paper is vested in their appeal to certain norms and common sense logic deeply ingrained in sexist and racially stratified societies like South Africa, which are the way they are because of our past. The use of name-calling and chastisement in relation to women journalists finds resonance because the context such that in this context, such that online and offline women are regularly called names or admonished as they speak truth to power. And the purpose of using this notion of mob violence is that while the insults are directed at the women, as somebody tweets it, other people chime in and the conversation or the discourse grows. And in that way, then it's a mob that is trying to keep this woman journalist silent because she's daring to speak truth to power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sisanda. We have 5 minutes left if somebody from the audience wants to make some questions. Yes, please. To give you the microphone for the recording. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Good day. My name is Jamie Knight, and I work for the UNESCO Central American office in Costa Rica. We cover Central America, and we have been putting a lot of emphasis on the mental health and resilience of female journalists. And I do hope that this topic is included in the revised UN Plan of Action, because I think there is a direct link between self-censorship and the psychological effects of these particular threats. A very interesting presentation. I wanted to know, in your interactions with female journalists in these countries, what did they tell you in terms of the extent to which these threats affected their mental health and how this affected their ability to be effective journalists? Thank you very much.
So my study did not involve any interviews with the journalists. However, I am a former journalist and obviously interact with my colleagues in that regard. And I think a previous presentation on this panel touched on it. What the main effect is that firstly, we see female journalists leaving newsrooms because of what this online harassment means. As I think two of the previous participants highlighted, there's really not that much support that they receive. And so in trying to cope, exiting the newsroom is a strategy. Secondly, they are a bit hesitant to engage on social media meaningfully, especially, and I think one of the participants made this point, especially when they are dealing with political or topics that are of a high profile nature that they know will direct attacks on them. So that means that, you know, they don't climb to the highest platform because they are holding back because of the repercussions which male colleagues may not face. So we're really seeing a chilling effect as the third consequence, in that other women journalists observe their counterparts being treated in this way, and even though the hate is not directed at them, it resonates and it creates conditions where the voices of women journalists are becoming more and more muted on certain issues as a response to the harassment and violence directed at them online.
Thank you very much. I don't know if the people that are online wants to answer these questions too about mental health in any way. If you want, just speak, please. Or if not, if there is some other question from the audience, or we just close. Okay, thank you very much. We close this panel and see you in the other activities of UNESCO.